a few words that he'd like to share. Frank, please go ahead.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and welcome everyone to our event today. We're really looking forward to it. I just want to make a few remarks here to announce a sad passing in the disability community. Stephen Esty passed away in the afternoon of September 11th, 2023. This is awful news for the disability community and to all who knew and loved Steve. Steve was a significant human rights leader and champion in the disability community in Canada and on the international scene. Steve was a critical force at the United Nations in the development of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, CRPD, and the ratification by the Canadian government of the CRPD in 2010. Steve was president of the National Educational Association of Disabled Students, NEADS, our organization, from 1990 to 1992, and went on to work as a consultant on a number of important NEADS projects. He later became national coordinator of the Council of Canadians with Disabilities and continued his long association with international disability organizations, including Disabled People's International, DPI. Steve was a key point person on many of CCD's human rights initiatives in Canada and abroad for many years. Steve was a Newfoundlander, always delighted to say that he was born in St. John's. In 1968, his family moved to Nova Scotia, and Steve grew up in Truro. He was a proud Xaverian, I have a hard time saying that, with a bachelor in philosophy from St. Francis Xavier University and a master's degree in international development from St. Mary's University, both in Nova Scotia. And that master's degree explains his path, international development work around the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and his work to support human rights of persons with disabilities in Canada and abroad. Steve was a wonderful friend to many of us in the disability community who loved him dearly. At this very sad time, we send our deepest condolences to Steve's wife, Anne McRae, son Eze, and family. A memorial service for Stephen Esty will be held on Tuesday, September 19th at 2 p.m. in the chapel at the Atlantic Funeral Home, 771 Main Street, Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. Visitation will be held at the same location on Sunday, September 17th from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. and Monday, September 18th from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. Importantly, we should note the service will also be available online for those who can't be in Nova Scotia to attend in person, with captioning and ASL interpretation available. There's information on registration for the memorial service on the NEADS Facebook page. I'd ask that we observe a moment's silence for Stephen Esty. Thank you. Please continue with the event, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Frank. That's very important to do. And we were lucky to have worked quite closely with Steve here at NEADS. I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Chloe, who will deliver this afternoon's land acknowledgement. Chloe, please feel free to begin when you're ready.
My name is Chloe, and my background of
ये जो बच्चे होते हैं एबनॉर्मल बच्चे उनके
Perhaps, Ellen, we can just get everybody muted. Apologize for that, Chloe. Feel free to continue when you're ready.
That I'm benefit from research and research generated and disseminated by First Nations, Métis, and Inuit persons, Indigenous persons, as well as to Spirit peoples. Un qui result of the traditional territory of the Montaran and Isinabek, Haute-Nationale and Lunenbiwak people, to the territory of the Algonquin people with forever be my own, and where I first learned from indigenous communities. When I take a walk with my dog on country roads or spending time with my horses in the field, I recognize my privilege to witness the beauty that is nature. When I regain knowledge in my own office, I acknowledge the coloniality that prevails in the face of disability studies and sexuality studies, where both non-community-based research and doctoral research are located. As a community-based researcher and a doctoral student, I am continuously learning about the intersection that exists between disability and indigeneity, and ultimately our society further marginalize these intersections. Through my work, I commit myself to unlearn knowledge embedded in colonialism and recognize the system of oppression that remain at the forefront of education. I strive to improve my own learning of the world that I readily benefit from.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Chloe. It's always important to think about positionality and our own sort of situated knowledge, and you did a beautiful job of that in today's land acknowledgement. I'd like to turn it over to my colleague Sarah, who's going to tell you a little bit about our organization for those who perhaps might not be familiar, or maybe you've been to events in the past and you just want a little bit of a reminder, as well as some of the programs and services that we have. So Sarah, whenever you're ready, feel free to begin.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So the National Educational Association of Disabled Students, NEADS, is a by and for cross-disability, cross-Canada charitable organization supporting full access to education and employment for disabled post-secondary students and graduates. Working across 3 strategic areas of debt reduction, experience in class and on campus, and employment, NEADS offers a variety of events, resources, reports, financial assistance programs, and opportunities for disabled students and graduates. Next slide, please. Thank you. So as vaccine and mask mandates lift and online learning options are rolled back, the National Educational Association of Disabled Students has launched a national advocacy campaign to support disabled post-secondary students' rights to safe and accessible education. Disabled students are asked to provide written submissions detailing their thoughts, feelings, and anxieties as they prepare for an unsafe and inaccessible fall term, and submissions will be shared in a final report and social media campaign. Submissions are being accepted on an ongoing basis for the social media campaign, and a follow-up report will be published upon the completion of the campaign. The National Advocacy Campaign remains ongoing, and disabled post-secondary students are strongly encouraged to share their personal experiences and perspectives. Submissions can be sent to carly.fox@neads.ca or DM'd to any @myneads social media account. On September 14th, the social media component of the campaign was launched, and disabled students' feedback is featured on a weekly and ongoing basis. NEADS will continue supporting disabled student groups, advocating for their rights before unions and faculties, and will continue offering letters of support, advocacy resources, and more. The NEADS State of the Schools tour is a hybrid cross-Canada tour visiting disabled student groups and post-secondary institutions across Canada. Partnering with local disabled student groups and community organizations, the tour provides an opportunity for disabled students to share their lived experiences and perspectives to help inform NEADS programming and State of the Schools reports. The first round of the tour took place November 2022 until June 2023, featuring stops in St. John's, Halifax, Ottawa, Montreal, Victoria, Winnipeg, and London. Round 2 starts at the end of this month in Fredericton and will continue until spring 2025. The NEADS National Student Awards Program encourages full access to post-secondary education for disabled students through addressing disproportionate financial costs and barriers to participation and recognizing the outstanding disabled students of the #MyNeeds community. Available awards include the NEADS National Student Awards, for which 42 awards of $3,000 were distributed in 2022, the NEADS Holly Bartlett Memorial Award and the NEADS Christine Nider Memorial Award, both at $1,000 each, the Caitlin Mitchell Memorial Scholarship for the Visually Impaired at $1,000, the Connor Clark and Lunn Financial Group Scholarship at $5,000, the AMI Robert Pearson Memorial Scholarships at $5,000 each, and the Canada Post Award at $10,000. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Next slide, we'll start with the self-advocacy, what we're here to talk about today. Thank you so much. So like I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, my name is Elizabeth. I use she, her, elle pronouns, and today I'm in a red blazer with a white blouse, and my hair is pulled partly up in a bun. I wanted to talk about self-advocacy because it's the start of a school year, and self-advocacy is a really important step on the road to success as a student with a disability, and also important in your disclosure. So self-advocacy refers to a couple of different things. It refers to being able to articulate your needs. It really requires you to be able to speak about your accommodations and what you're going to need, but it also requires you to stand up for yourself. Advocacy is being assertive, never aggressive, and it means being able to understand yourself and your disability. It can be challenging to do, but there are lots of tips and tricks that we're going to go through today to help you become a better self-advocate. And self-advocacy is a skill that we're always developing and honing, and certainly something after 10 years of post-secondary, I'm still working on. So next slide. So some tips for self-advocacy. One of the really important things is to understand your disability and your own strengths and challenges. So let me unpack what that tip means. So myself, I live with a visual disability. So I need to not only understand what that means for me in navigating my environment, but what that's going to mean for me in an academic classroom. So for me, it's going to mean asking faculty and staff for materials in electronic formats, preferably in Microsoft Word or in a text-based format. It's going to mean asking for things in advance if possible. And it's going to mean for me being able to get some assistance navigating campus prior to going to classes. Strengths and challenges. This one I really like. So understand your disability, but your strengths and challenges, and we all have them. So strengths can be things like, for me, I'm highly verbal. I'm able to talk about my disability in a way that focuses on what my accommodations are. People don't ever need to know your medical diagnosis or specific details of your disability. You're really focusing on what you're going to need to be successful in the classroom. So I might say something like, I'm Elizabeth, I have a visual difference, I'm going to require materials electronically, and I'm going to need to come and see the space prior to coming to class or coming to an event. Strengths. So again, thinking, what am I good at? And this might be something as simple as, again, I'm really organized. So I know I work with a lot of people on my team that are very organized. They're able to sort of put things together in advance. Another strength could be something like, I'm a good problem solver. I tend to think that because we as people with disabilities navigate our world a little bit differently, we're all really good problem solvers. And what are your challenges? So these might be things that you're working on, perhaps an area of growth. These might be things that due to your disability are a little bit more difficult. So I have known people that struggle with executive function or organization. That's okay. Just knowing what those things are and being able to have some tools in your toolkit to help you deal with those challenges. Understand your legal rights and responsibilities. So, I always like to say we have rights, but we also have responsibilities. So you have a right to an accommodation if you have documentation that proves that you have a disability and you're set up with accessible education or accessible learning, depending on your school. That name may vary, but you also have responsibilities. So for example, at my university, you are responsible for communicating with your disability service provider or disability services office what your accommodation needs are, and then you work together to develop a plan. You're responsible to let your professors will all know about your accommodations, but you're responsible to sort of follow up if there's any problem. You're responsible to book your exams if you're somebody that's taking exams at my particular institution. So there are responsibilities as well as rights, and they kind of go hand in hand. So we certainly have those rights under human rights that protect us and make sure that we're getting the accommodations that we need. But we also have responsibility. And one of those responsibilities is that we do need to be able to articulate and explain what it is we need in a way that focuses on the accommodation and not a diagnosis or disability. So I always like to say disclosure, and I talk about this as, again, disclosing a need for something, never personal details, but it's really important to find a time with a professor or a teaching assistant that works for them. I've been on both sides of the table. I've been a teaching assistant and I've been a student. And you want to make sure people have the space to have this conversation. So going up after class on the first day when everybody's talking to the TA or professor can be a challenge. So I always like to go up to a professor, perhaps after class, and say, is there a good time to come speak with you? Perhaps during your office hours, or send a quick email note. Find a time that's mutually convenient. I always like to say time, space, and place, and you're wanting to find a quiet place. So perhaps their office or going for a cup of coffee, if that's something with which you're both comfortable, but trying not to do it when they're harried and got other things on the go is really important. And this is also a sensitive conversation, so you don't want to be having it in front of other peers. When possible, and if comfortable doing so, trying to disclose when, before problems arise. So at the beginning of the term, that's not always possible. Sometimes we acquire disabilities throughout the term. That's okay. But trying to have these conversations early on in the term, depending on your school, you might do that the week before classes start if you know your professors for your courses, or you may wish to do that in that first week at that first office hour, but trying to do it early on. And I would add here, and I don't have it on my slide, but I would add you also want to register with Accessible Education or Accessible Learning as soon as you can. If you get your acceptance, congratulations, that's a big step, but then you want to have that registration process kicked off and in place sort of as soon as possible, because the reality is September is very busy for those disability service offices. So doing that as soon as you can really helps make sure that you're as successful as you can for the school year. We'll go to the next slide. Thank you very much. So a couple more tips. And I would actually say this is probably one of my favorite tips. Practice disclosing with people that you're comfortable with, or I should say with whom you're comfortable. Bad grammar there on my part. I like this because this can be tricky, especially for those of us who maybe have had IEPs in high school, or perhaps have acquired a disability a little bit later on, so we don't maybe have the practice disclosing. So finding somebody, could be a trusted colleague or friend or family member, and just kind of practicing what disclosure could look like. So it could be something as simple as practicing, what you're going to say in an email to set up an appointment with disability services. So you might be talking about things like, okay, I have some medical documentation, I'd like to make an appointment. Or it could be practicing actually sitting down and meeting with a professor and talking about your accommodations for the term. Your accommodations aren't negotiated by you and the prof, they're set with you and the disability services office, but it's important to go through them with a professor in case they have any questions. So practicing that with a person that you trust, that's safe, that can give you some feedback is really important, because you may feel a little bit nervous the first time you do it with a professor. And you can always ask for help with accessible services or accessible learning or support staff. I know that at our university, we have program assistants and project assistants within accessible education. Those are great people to kind of say, hey, I want to sit down with you and just talk about that first accommodations conversation and what that's going to feel and look like. Asking for help, there's no shame in it, and I actually encourage it. And being self-aware. So, again, where might my gaps be? Where are my strengths? So a gap for me when I started undergrad was I'd been to a school for the blind. So I was very used to having my accommodations just provided. I actually had no idea what I was supposed to ask for or who I was supposed to go to. But I was aware that I didn't know. So that awareness piece is really important, just being self-aware and being able to reflect on that. So in order to advocate for yourself, you need to know yourself, your disability, and be able to describe your disability related accommodations, which involves knowing your strengths and weaknesses, like I said earlier. So we'll pop to the next slide, but before I continue, I just want to pause and see if there are any questions or comments. You can pop those in the chat, or you can verbalize them out loud. I know this is a lot of information and I've been talking a lot, so I just want to do a quick pause and see if folks have any questions or comments at this moment. Just give people a moment. I know it can take people a moment to type into the chat. Okay, so I'm not hearing any, so I will continue with Know Your Needs. So with your accessibility counselor, you can assess different types of accommodations that you might need. So when I started undergrad, it was really looking at how do you learn best? So I'm an auditory learner, I process best that way. So we opted for me to receive books auditorily or electronically. Thinking about things like I might need extra time. So being able to have that conversation. You can talk about sort of what's worked in high school, or if you're going to graduate school, what's worked in undergrad, knowing that these are different learning spaces. So there might need to be some tweaks. You can also think a little bit about, you can ask what accommodations are available. I know when I first started my undergraduate, I didn't actually know what was available. Oh, so we do have a question from Kamsma. So this is about the accommodations plan. So yes, your plan, at least at my university, so your list of accommodations is sent to your professor. What I encourage people to do is then follow up to make sure that the professor received that plan, because that's important, and then to ask if they have any questions. So I hope, Kemma, that answered your question. So again, it's thinking about determining what assistance you need. And thinking about, what that's going to look like. And that can vary course to course. So I took a statistics course, and I told you just a moment ago that I'm a very auditory learner. But in my statistics course, I needed hard copy Braille because I had to read graphs. So thinking about knowing what you need, that can depend on what course you're in, or it can depend sort of just what stage of your degree you're in, because what I needed in undergrad isn't what I'm going to need in graduate school. I won't get too much into that because we've had lots of workshops on the differences between undergrad and graduate accommodations. But I always like to ask people to evaluate past accommodations and what's worked. So, maybe in high school you had extra time and that worked. So great, thinking about that. Or maybe in a previous degree or diploma, or even in the workplace, you had a quiet space to work, or you had noise canceling headphones. Those are things that you can bring to the table and say, this has really worked. This was really effective. Let's try implementing this and see what works. You can also, like I said, ask what accommodations are available and assess areas of difficulty. So for me, in my first year of university, a really big area of difficulty was just navigating campus. So one of the accommodations that was put in place was to have some sighted guide assistance going from class to class. You might say, you might not know your areas of difficulty until you've done a couple of semesters, and then you're maybe thinking, okay, well, one of my areas of difficulty is actually doing an exam in a big room with people. So then maybe you do talk about an accommodated exam. So accommodations really can ebb and flow, and they can change over time. They're not static. So what you needed in one year may not be what you need in the next year. So hop to that next slide. Just give us a moment to get that slide up. So practice assertiveness, and I talked a little bit about this earlier. Practicing assertiveness is really important. So, when we're advocating for accommodations, or we're advocating for ourselves in general on campus, or we're advocating collectively with fellow students, we want to be assertive, never aggressive. So assertive means being clear, direct, and to the point. It never means sort of becoming into that anger zone. I appreciate and recognize that there can be lots of things that make us feel angry, but we want to make sure that we're not bringing those into the space where we're advocating, or at least trying not to. Knowing your rights is really important. So there are, on most campuses, an office of equity, diversity, inclusion that can help you sort of establish, what are your rights and what are your responsibilities, as well as accessible education. Some campuses also, and I would say most, have human rights offices and ombuds people. Those are all great people and organizations and groups to go to understand and better know your rights. But then, like I said, that's always paired with responsibilities. So problem solving and making decisions, really important. So perhaps if you're on this call and you're somebody coming into university or college from high school, you had teachers or support staff that were helping you to make decisions or making them on your behalf. In post-secondary, that's obviously a lot different. So problem solving can take place, certainly with the support of staff, but you're expected to sort of take that on. And as well, just sort of being able to make your own decisions. So maybe that means, like in my case, my first year of grad school, I dropped a course. So making the decision that was right for me. So again, that will just depend on sort of where you're at in your journey. And we'll pop to that next slide. So you can develop, I like to say, self-confidence is something you develop, and I sort of think of it like a toolkit. So here are some things that I can do to sort of help me become more confident in who I am and what my rights are, my responsibilities, but also just sort of more broadly what's happened before me in the disability community to even make it possible for me to go to school. So we were actually talking about this before the workshop started today. disability civil rights movements. And we were talking about somebody by the name of Judy Heumann. So, reading about people that have disabilities that have come before us, that have pioneered the way, that's a really empowering way to A, feel validated and like you're not alone, but also B, to really recognize the work that has been done before us. Learning about disability from diversity and cultural perspectives. And I would also say learning about disability organizations as well. Finding peer support among other disabled students. So this one, I would like to think we're all engaged in peer support. Disabled students groups might exist on your campus, so you can certainly check in to see if there's any groups through your student union that have support for students with disabilities. So by and for, so run by disabled students, for disabled students. NEADS, so this organization is a great resource. Canadian Council, CCD, Canadian Council of Disability is another great resource. So thinking about, where you can get peer support. Advocacy can be isolating and it can be lonely at times, especially if we feel like we're sort of fighting that uphill battle. We're pushing that boulder up the hill alone. So finding that peer support, I can't stress that enough. And learning to value the strengths that we've developed. So I kind of joked a little bit earlier that problem solving is something I think we're all really good at because we solve problems on a daily basis. So being able to really value that and then being able to articulate it. I've articulated a number of times in job interviews that problem solving is a really great strength that I bring to the table. So I'll pop to the next slide. And I just want to again take a break and pause for any questions or comments. We will have discussion at the end, but this is a lot of information. So I just wanted to break it up and provide folks a moment to ask any questions or share any comments. Any questions or comments? You can pop them in the chat. So utilize support. We'll pop to slide 16. So I kind of talked about this earlier, but self-advocacy can be challenging and isolating. So good self-advocates always have support. So I, on a regular basis, I'm in my doctoral studies at Western University, meet with colleagues to discuss challenges that they're facing in graduate education as fellow disabled students and peers. This could be things like, for example, how do you attend conferences internationally as a disabled student who has access needs? I've had some really wholesome discussions with peers and colleagues about that. What does that look like for me? And being able to kind of talk about some of the challenges. Peer support might also look like, talking about funding. How are you getting funding to pursue your PhD? You might be taking longer, or your degree in general. For me, it's a PhD. So having that peer support is really important, and utilizing those supports. And I've got a website up here on the screen, Learning Disabilities Online, which is really helpful in terms of peer support as well. I think self-advocacy, again, it's about knowing how to ask questions and knowing how to ask for help, and that we should not feel alone. I won't get into it today because we've done lots of workshops on this, but collective advocacy is where we're sort of advocating for something together. So you might do that through your disabled students group on campus. You might do that through your student union. And that's another way for me personally, I felt less alone, is being able to advocate with other people towards a common goal. And that feels really empowering. All right, so the slide 17, preparing for meetings. So it's really important when you're thinking about having that first meeting with whether it's a disability services provider or a professor, just to prepare and think about what that is going to look like. So for me, what works to prepare is, like I said earlier in the presentation, to practice with someone and to write things down. So thinking about what am I going into this meeting wanting or expecting? So am I expecting a change to my accommodations because something's not working? Am I expecting that I'm going to need to set up a meeting with my accessible education counselor and my professor because an accommodation isn't being honored? So knowing before I walk through those doors what my goal is, what am I expecting out of this meeting? Thinking about if it's maybe an initial meeting, what are some accommodations that you could benefit from and what are your access needs? Thinking through that ahead of time, being able to articulate that is really important. So for me, one of the things I might go into a meeting and talk about is it really helps me when I'm able to have material sent in advance, when I'm not getting things the day of. Unfortunately, the reality is that's not always possible, but being able to know that and articulate that is really important. I also think part of preparing for meetings is coming into it in a calm headspace. If we're already sort of on the defense, then that's going to show in the way that we're interacting in the meeting. So just trying to think about, how we're sort of positioning and coming to the meeting. Identify goals and desirable outcomes. So I kind of said this at the start, like thinking about what do I want to get out of this? What are the goals that I have? And just being able to sort of articulate that. Understand duty to accommodate and undue hardship. So yes, there's a duty to accommodate up to a certain point, that being health and safety and cost, but understanding that and knowing that, but also being able to explain that in a sort of plain language way, because not everybody will be familiar with those terms. Just pop to the next slide. So I kind of like this one. It's a bit tongue in cheek, but I put it on here. Play nice if you can. I said this in the previous slide, but it's the old sort of vinegar and honey. It is hard sometimes to be nice and diplomatic, especially if our grades are maybe slipping or we're not feeling heard. But I do think that most people truly want to help, and building allyship is done through calling. I like to say calling in, not calling out. So, perhaps it's just a matter of you are working with a faculty member who's never had a student with a disability or your specific disability. I had that a lot. I was told, by many faculty, they've never worked with someone who's blind. And so being able to educate and explain, although it was exhausting and it took a lot of labor on my part, what it actually meant in the end. Thanks, Kansma. What it meant in the end was that I actually built some very solid collegial relationships, and I'm still very close colleagues with many of my undergraduate professors. So that's why it sounds silly, but if you can, play nice if you can. And that does sometimes mean some extra work on our part. And I acknowledge that education is exhausting and that we're often doing a lot of explaining and sort of that epistemic labor. I recognize that, but play nice if you can. Next slide. So asking what is available, you can learn about better accommodations than maybe you originally planned by asking what's available. I'll use an example to articulate. I'd never taken a stats course. It was required for my undergrad and my master's degree. And I literally didn't know how I would do it. I'd kind of done a bit of research. So I asked what the options were, and we talked about you could get the graphs in Braille, the book in Braille. We could have a tutor that works with you one-on-one. And then one of the things that actually was offered to me by the professor, and I love to tell this story because it's ingenuity and innovation all rolled into one, was we can actually make the graphs out of Play-Doh in my office, and you can come and experience what that graph looks like. I never actually would have thought of that, and I asked. So these things sound obvious, but it's sort of in practicality how they sort of play out. And that was sort of a really aha moment for me. And, we might prevent ourselves from accessing holistic or comprehensive or wraparound supports if we're not asking those questions. And I actually ended up doing really well in the stats course. So I was pleased with that. So just thinking about, asking what's available, and it doesn't just have to be accommodations, but, are there other supports on campus that are available to me that might help? So for example, I didn't actually know as a PhD student that I could use the Writing Center for looking over scholarship applications. I didn't know that, but I asked about supports available to help students apply for scholarship, and I was told the Writing Center was an option for looking over your work. Learning development and success, not specific to disability, but they do a lot of supports around study, tips for studying, time management, goal setting, breaking down tasks. They do group sessions and one-on-one sessions. And again, that's not disability specific, but really helpful. The library is another big one. I had no idea that Western libraries, and I'm using Western because that's what I know, but again, these things probably translate in some way, shape, or form to other schools, has a person that will actually put things into an accessible format for you. So again, when I say asking about supports, I'm not just thinking disability, but more broadly. Yes, Kansma just noted that the library is very helpful, and I would agree with that, Kansma. So thank you, and shout out to any library staff on the call. Next slide. So sometimes, and I've talked about this, you know, advocacy can be lonely. So you can bring a peer to support you at a meeting if you're not comfortable. Many student groups will offer peer support. Some even offer a confidential service, student union groups, where you can actually go and talk through a challenge with a peer confidentially. You can always bring a peer or a trusted colleague to a meeting if you're not comfortable. Typically, their job is to take notes and be a second set of ears. They don't generally speak on your behalf unless that's something that you've sort of arranged. It's really important to let the person you're meeting with know you're going to bring someone. You don't sort of want to kind of come in and you know, do that without letting people know. It's just a courtesy, but peer support can be really helpful. I've done that if I'm going to a meeting where I know that my emotions might run a bit high. So bringing in that extra peer to say, well, actually what they said was this is really helpful. And always talk to your peer and find out, kind of tell them a little bit about what you're expecting from the meeting and how they can best support you. So that might be, you know, hey, Chloe, could you take some notes in this meeting? I'm going to a meeting about accessible transportation. I'm feeling pretty frustrated with how things have been going. I know I might not hear everything. Can you take some notes? Or can you just sit there and sort of be a silent presence? But just making sure that your peer who's supporting you is prepared and knows what's expected of them. Next slide. So there's a reason I put this, you know, where I did, you know, towards the back half. Escalate if necessary. There are cases where accommodations aren't honored by teaching assistants, professors, and others on campus. It could be residents where an accommodation that was set up with housing wasn't honored, and it is okay to escalate. I would say it's really important to know the chain of command. So I'm not going to go to the president of Western if something that I've requested isn't in place. But I might go, so for example, I can actually share an example. We on the Western campus have an accessible van that takes students from class to class, but it doesn't run in the summer because the undergraduate population goes home. Western is primarily an undergraduate campus. We have about 7,000 graduate students, so the rest are all undergrads, so it doesn't run. And myself and a colleague went to accessible education, and we started to have some conversations about, you know, the impact that that's having on students with disabilities who are on campus through the summer. Extreme heat, construction. London likes to do construction in the summer, and the safety that's caused, safety concerns it's caused. So that initial meeting was had, and then I took that up to the person above accessible education, of course, with that person involved as well, and bringing in more and more people to the table to help solve the problem. But it wasn't an immediate escalation. Again, sort of just thinking about, you know, building allyship. We want to try to work with the people on our team, and then if that's not working for any number of reasons, then we do that escalating. So of course it's an ideal step. You know, if you're feeling like you've been met with ableism, And no worries, Anne, we're happier. If you are feeling like you're being met with ableism, again, you can escalate, but just knowing the chain of command. And sometimes that just means doing a little bit of research on your part, like who would be the next person I go to. So in my case, I involved the Director of Accessible Education, the Director of Student Experience, and our Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion unit. But knowing who those people are in that chain of command is really important, because it's just, courtesy to make sure that you're sort of following that chain of command. Some additional tips on our next slide here. Self-care is really important to self-advocacy. I feel like this could actually be a whole workshop. We know that advocacy, not just for our own needs, but sort of more globally, can be challenging. So when I say globally, I think about things that impact my community as a whole that I'm a part of. So, access to education isn't just about Elizabeth, but about all students with disabilities. If I don't take care of me, I can't be effective in speaking up for myself and speaking up as a part of my community. So I won't sort of get into self-care. It's different for everybody, but it is important to think about your own thinking about your own needs, and and it's also okay to say, I'm not really in a space to take on this advocacy project at the moment. So for example, again, on our campus, there are a number of elevators that don't have Braille. I'd love to snap my fingers and get those fixed tomorrow, but the reality is I only have so many spoons, so much energy, and so that's just not something I can take on at the moment, and that's okay. We don't have to advocate for everything all at once, all the time, and so just knowing that and being able to check in with yourself or a trusted peer. So I know I've kind of drummed home peer support a lot, but it's mutual peer support is so important. And I say that as somebody that's been to an institution where I was one of very few disabled students, and that was pretty lonely, to be truthful. And then also somebody who's now at an institution where there are many of us from whom I draw peer support. And so that's just really important to think about. And, when in doubt, ask. Knowing your rights is really important, but doing your research and figuring out what those rights are. And there are lots of resources that can help you with that. So let's flip to the next slide. So I just wanted to talk about this concept of collective advocacy and what that is. So, collective advocacy, and our references are up here, but collective advocacy is just, again, doing things together as a collective, as a group. And that can be really helpful. So we'll pop our references here on our last slide, if we might, just so people can see where we drew the information from today. Thanks. And I want to just open it up at this point for discussion and questions. That was a lot of information, and I'd love to have a little bit of a chat and hear sort of what resonated with you. If you have questions, things you want me to go back over, or just any tips that I didn't cover that you'd really like to share. So and Alan's just popped in Council of Canadians with Disabilities in the chat as a link. So thank you, Alan, for that. Yes. Perfect. So Elena, I'm going to read out your question because it is a little bit long. So a working student who is part-time requesting accommodations, would I suggest using those same processes? I would say yes and more. So sometimes part-time students have different requirements in terms of, reduced course load to consider. I will say that if you are a student with a disability, check to see what your reduced course load is that still allows you to be a full-time student. So when I was in undergrad, I could take 3 courses and still be considered a full-time student. But for people who aren't registered with accessible learning, that would be considered part-time. So that's one tip I would have, is just to check in and see. There are often groups on campus for mature students or working students, like students who are parents, around just sort of navigating your studies while you're juggling this whole other world. So I would encourage checking those out. But yes, I would say all these resources and more, because there's probably groups that are specific to sort of part-time or working students. And Erin, do you want to come off mic and ask your question? Would you be comfortable with that? Or would someone mind just reading out Erin's question? Either is fine.
I think Erin mentioned that they were going to leave, so I don't think they had a question.
Oh, okay.
But they
Sorry,
said it's great information. Yeah. This
Okay.
is Alana speaking as well. Thank you for reading out my question.
Yeah, no
It
problem.
was really long. Thank you.
No, not a problem at all. Happy to do it. Other questions or comments or reflections that folks want to share? I think, one thing that I would share, being, we've sort of finished the formal presentation, but just like a tip I would share, in addition to sort of reduced course load, and we touched on this sort of when Sarah talked about scholarships, is just to think about what scholarships might be available specifically for you as students with disabilities. So I'm going to do a little plug here for disabilityawards.ca, which is a wonderful, wonderful resource that my colleague Sarah and Aaliyah have worked to put together, all with information about disability scholarships. There are bursaries through the OSAP program, so Ontario Student Assistance Program, and grants that can help students with disabilities acquire and purchase technology and tutoring and note-taking. So I didn't touch a lot on funding because Sarah did a great job at the beginning of explaining some of the scholarships we have, but I do encourage you to look at specific funding for students with disabilities, because there are lots of scholarships, and I adjudicate scholarships in a couple of different spheres that I'm involved in, and I'm always amazed how much money we have left over at the end of the year that hasn't been claimed. So do look for that. And Anne, I see your hand up. So please go ahead and unmute and share whenever you're ready.
Hey, yeah, I'm really sorry I was late. You know me, but I like to come. I'm going to stretch the scholarship and all the different funding that there is available, because that's thing that
And we're having a little bit of difficulty hearing you, Anne. Would you mind coming a touch closer to your microphone?
that's something scholarship and funding is something that I really feel that people need to know about, because yeah, a lot of people don't, and yeah, there's lots of money left over. So
Yeah.
funding is something that I think people really do need to know about, and that there is lots of funding out there, specifically for people with disabilities and also people that don't have disabilities. And many of these scholarships and bursaries not go unclaimed. So that was something I wanted to plug in. And otherwise, I'm very sorry I was late.
That's okay, Anne. I'll just repeat what you said. Anne was just sort of affirming and lifting up what I'd said with regards to scholarships and just sort of doing your research. To Susan's point, I'm happy to make my slides available to attendees. I would just ask that you keep them sort of for your own purposes and that they not be sort of redistributed or shared. But I'm fine with that if my other colleagues on the team are. Taryn, yes, Emily Carr's disability. Okay, wonderful. Okay, great. So I'm going to read that out. This is really about a tip for self-care, and that is the ability, if you need to take a term off or a year off without penalty. Do you want to say more about that, Tarek? Would you feel comfortable unmuting your microphone?
Hi folks, my name is Taryn. Yeah, I think one of the things that I did in my undergrad at Emily Carr was acknowledging that, the pacing of my program or the minor that I was in, wasn't quite in alignment with what I wanted my goals to be. And instead of dropping out of the university, which I also had done, I was able to take extra time to just focus on life and my health and wellness outside of the academic space, and to recognize that it's there when I return I didn't have to do my program in 4 years. Like I think a lot of disabled and neurodivergent students get tossed in this ableism of 4 years in an undergraduate degree concept, and to really just allow students and ourselves to slow that process down in a way that honors care at the center of our education. And so this is a way that like allows us to just, take that advocacy beyond a learning space and really into like our needs as bodies as well. And that's the end of my current thought. Thanks.
I love that. And I didn't touch on milestones, and that is a great tip. I think for sure we have these sort of, whether they're sort of formal written down milestones or milestones that sort of are in our own sort of preconceived notions from societal sort of way that we think about transitions in our world, but slowing things down is key. I don't know when I'll be done my PhD. I'm going into my 4th year. Western gives you 4 years of funding, and that's maybe their way of saying it should take you 4 years, although I haven't met anybody in my program who's, done a PhD in 4 years, but I love this. And I think we need to, whether it's a medical leave or just a leave for self-care, it's really important. And you're getting lots of sort of kudos in the chat box. So thank you for that. Other comments or thoughts that people would like to share?
Hi,
go ahead.
Kanza. Hi, this is Kanza. And I always feel that, before the start of any of the institution with a person with disability, there is no formal guidance given to a student coming in, which makes it very hard for them to kind of network, fish around, especially when you are not from the community and you have coming from different culture or different country. It's very hard for them to adjust in a new environment and to network and to know the pros and cons of, things like you're saying, degree in 4 years and not accomplishing the goals in whatever time frame is given, and how to advocate is another level of barrier for the individuals who are disabled and coming from different culture background without enough knowledge about the system and the language. I'm kind of good that way, but I find it hard for my community members. They need some kind of a help there for advocacy, which I find is a vacuum. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good point. So, that's the piece around sort of just knowing what you don't know what you don't know. So sort of knowing sort of how to have that initial conversation. Yeah. And I think you're right. Like, there's not a lot of sort of, I think there are beginning to be transition programs for especially undergraduate, but I would argue we need it sort of going into grad school as well. Just sort of like, hey, this is what you kind of need to know and expect. I know Western's done a great job of some orientation around that this month, but yeah, absolutely. To your point. I saw another comment in the chat. Just wondering if somebody would mind reading that out, because it's seemed to have disappeared on my end. But I think it would be great for folks to hear.
Here's a comment here from Taryn.
Okay.
Is that covered already? Taryn here from Emily Carr's.
I think it was Marlon.
Marlon. Okay, just a second. I just want to find that.
Sorry, Marlon. We are finding your comment.
I'm not seeing that. Somebody else seeing that?
I am not seeing it either.
Was it sent to you, Elizabeth, directly? Perhaps Marlon, if she or they are comfortable, could speak.
Just unmute and share, yeah.
Their comment.
There's one from Wes and Frank. I actually might get you to answer this one about work integrated learning and whether NEADS supports accommodations for work integrated learning.
It would be helpful to know more about what this person means about work integrated learning. I mean, work integrated learning can be a lot of different things in the post-secondary context. So, for example, we think about students having work integrated learning opportunities that could be part of their academic program of study. So that could be co-op placements, internships. It could also be, for example, summer jobs that you get. And those summer jobs, you could, you could have summer jobs with all sorts of different types of organizations and employers that could be very relevant to your field of study. And we know that there are many programs out there that are supportive of work integrated learning opportunities, including perhaps the biggest employment program that's offered across Canada, the Canada Summer Jobs Program. We regularly hire students for the summer at NEADS through the Canada Summer Jobs Program. I think that it's a really good idea if you're looking for work integrated learning opportunities, that is employment that complements your field of study and your career path, to make a point of checking out career services on your campus, career and employment services, whatever it may be called. Every public post-secondary school has a career and employment center, and that could mean just checking out jobs that are available online through the website of the Career Center. But it could also be, and I think this is really important, making an effort on your part to make appointments to see people who work in career services, and have an advisor that can look at your CV, that can comment, provide some advice with respect to how you conduct yourself in an interview, how you deal with and navigate issues of disability around disclosure, for example, when to disclose, whether to disclose even, and how much information to disclose. And usually when it comes to that sort of thing in work integrated learning opportunities or other employment opportunities, it really has to do with whether your disability requires accommodations to be effective in the workplace, that that you need to provide some sort of information to the organization that will hire you, that will enable you to get the supports that you need. But in many cases, there's no requirement for on your part for disclosure of disability if it doesn't have any relevance to the work experience. So I think work integrated learning is really all about taking advantage of various kinds of employment opportunities available to you that can build your CV and your experience, and add it to your academic experience to set you on your career path. And let's not forget that there can be lots of great work integrated learning opportunities or employment opportunities right on campus, right at your university and college. That could involve employment opportunities in your faculty where you're studying. It could involve employment opportunities through the students' union, or through centers that the student union supports. Elizabeth had mentioned disabled students groups that are peer support groups of students with disabilities working for students with disabilities. Those can be employment opportunities, and some of them can be considered work integrated learning. They're relevant to your academic program of study and your career pursuits. And let's not forget that even jobs that we wouldn't consider necessarily could be relevant to our career path also teach us lots of important skills. So even working in a pub or working for some kind of a service or center on campus that may not necessarily be directly related to your field of study, provides you just the same with excellent skills that you can utilize to launch your career or to build your experience in CV. I'm not sure if I answered the question, but I did my best.
That's great. Thank you, Frank. If there are no other questions, I'm happy to end us here. Happy to stay on. And Alan just popped a resource in the chat, but I'm happy to sort of end us here, knowing that you can always email myself, and I'll pop my email into the chat box, or any of my colleagues if you have questions or want to follow up. We will, of course, the recording will be available. And like I said earlier, I will share my slides. I just ask that they not be sort of distributed beyond your own resources. But thank you for attending today's workshop. We've got a couple coming up, so please just stay tuned. If you haven't signed up for our NEADS newsletter, do that. You can follow us on any of the socials, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and you can, of course, always email us if you'd like to know more about what we're doing and what we're up to. So with that, I will thank everybody and wish everybody a lovely Friday afternoon.